For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Father God, we want to thank you so much for this opportunity to be a part of a show that tells the truth, and these special guests who come with years of knowledge and just a better understanding. Lord, help us learn, help us to be obedient to what your needs are for this republic and this nation. We pray in your son's name. Amen. Dan Happel, I yield the floor to you, sir.
Thank you, Kelby. Tonight we've got a program on international national sovereign debt funds. And we have a very special guest who's been on our program a number of times, but Bob Fanning is a bond expert extraordinaire and really understands these markets and really understands what's going on with the financial sector and at the international and the national level. And Bob is a very experienced bond trader. He was with the Chicago Board of Trade for many years. And Bob, I welcome you to the show. And is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I would, Dan. Thank you. I've lived my life trying to curry my father's favor, and he was a broker before me. And he was a very good broker, and he wanted to make sure his sons followed in his footsteps properly, and so we were trained not only on Wall Street and in our graduate schools of business, but on the job under our father's watchful eye. So I celebrate my dad tonight as we discuss the fixed income markets. And fixed income, I gravitated to fixed income because it was big numbers, and the bigger the numbers, the bigger the commissions. So if you could get a guy to do a trade, it was a lot better than looking for 100 shares from a mom and pop. But anyway, I digress. What I did after spending a decade with my dad is I went down to the Chicago Board of Trade and I opened a institutional financial futures brokerage from the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade. And they liked me because I called it like I saw it. I said, it's a sell here, it's a buy there, this is the instrument that's used to hedge, etc. So I did pretty well down there. And what I would like to fast forward to is you had one of my friends and I as a guest on May 18th. His name is Charles K. Ortel. He's an international financier, Harvard MBA, and he's the man who did the forensic accounting on the Clinton Foundation. And if there's any one person that can take a deep bow for Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton, it would be Charles Ortel, because Mr. Trump picked up on it and called her Crooked Hillary. But I digress. We have a situation in the global bond markets, and the reason I brought up Charles Ortel is it arrogant me over dinner, October of 14, October 7th of 14, we were talking about derivatives, and Charles pointed out that he was concerned about counterparty risk, and I realized that Charles was a real cut above most of the other people that I had dealt with. And we were concerned about derivatives, and especially the ones that brought the system down, which are called credit default swaps. Those are derivatives. They're part of 1.2 quadrillion. That's 1,000 trillion. That's 1,200 trillion. 1.2 quadrillion in derivatives, OTC, over-the-counter, unregulated, unmargined derivatives, and they are basically the spawn of the International Swaps Dealers Association and J.P. Morgan, and especially Goldman Sachs, who stack the Federal Reserve, who run the Federal Reserve. And we spoke of derivatives over dinner in New York at a restaurant called Sidecar. And I realized that Warren Buffett was destruction. So I pay attention to especially credit default swaps, and I urge your listeners to write this down. You can do a Google alert for market, M-A-R-K-I-T, credit default swaps. And I got an alert the other day. And I've been looking for a reason why bonds would top. They're in a bubble. Bonds are in a bubble. Bonds have been in a bubble since 2008, when the printing presses just went completely hog wild, bailing out bankers with quantitative easing 1 through 3. They just kept the printing presses open. They didn't do it for mom and pop. They didn't do it for Main Street. They don't care about you. They care about their global derivatives book and the cost to carry that derivatives book. And the cost to carry, if you have a zero interest rate policy, then the International Swaps Dealers Association doesn't have to pay any interest to carry their derivatives bets. Unlike all other commodities. All other commodities in the world have a cost to carry. You know, it costs money to rent a silo to keep your corn in. So, but if you captured the regulators and you do regulatory arbitrage and you transfer the money away from savers in 6,700 community banks, then the savers get nothing, and the International Swaps Dealers Association gets to carry their book for free because they control the government. And so as I started this stream, I suggest to your listeners to do a Google search and keep an eye on sovereign debt credit default swaps, which is what I'm doing. And I'm befuddled. I told Charles Ortell and Christopher Whalen over dinner that I consider myself the greatest bear market trader that ever lived, which is a pile of crap. But it was the way I view myself, because I never miss an opportunity to hedge, and I pride myself on hedging at the right time. And so bonds have gone to 159, 156, and stayed there. To draw a comparison, when I got into the business, went down to the Board of Trade at the age of 31, and Jimmy Carter was president, and Paul Volcker was the chairman of the Federal Reserve. You had 15% treasuries. The bond future, which was priced at 55.05, it's currently 159, 156. They tripled, and they show no hope of going down right now. The reason they're not going down is called flight to safety. We have those who may consider the stock market overpriced at these levels. I'm not qualified to opine on that, whether it's overpriced or not. What I am saying is a flight to quality would be when people exit the stock market and buy bonds to protect their assets. Now you've got the choice of getting into $159 bonds when they used to be at 55, and they show no sign of going down, which makes one wonder why are bonds so stubbornly hung on the highs? Quantitative easing. Janet Yellen announced that it was over. Bonds didn't go down. So what's the deal?
Mm-hmm.
We have credit default swaps on sovereign debt, and that sovereign debt is from all around the world. And the credit default swaps did a hiccup in the Kuwait, Qatar area, their stock markets or their bond markets. They list all of that, their bonds over on the Irish exchange, the Dublin exchange. But the credit default swaps, the first blink that I got was on the stuff from third world countries, if you call Qatar and United Arab Emirates and Kuwait a third world country. But why? What's going on over there? And so I did deep analytics, and I realized that they're borrowing money too, hand over fist, to fund their trade deficits. And I remember back last spring, Mr. Trump had signed 2 executive orders demanding study of trade deficits. The predators, the vultures in the press, immediately jumped on at the Russia thing, even as his pen was still on the executive orders. Mr. Trump is a brilliant president, in my mind, and he has great tactics. And I think that what he was calling to the attention is America is financing a trade deficit. But we've also started to give a bad example to the rest of the world. So they issue debt in order to finance their trade deficit. So that's like owning a Dairy Queen, selling ice cream cones between June and September, living large, living the life of Riley, thinking you're elite, and then having 7 months where you have nothing coming in. That would be an analogy to a trade deficit. Mm-hmm. We have a deficit. We're not selling enough stuff. And everybody in the world thinks that that gives them the right to go borrow. And I see that as globally systemically unsustainable to be funding trade deficits with borrowed money. That'd be like having your Dairy Queen close down on Labor Day and then just going out and throwing a Rolls Royce on the charge card. Mm-hmm. It's not sustainable.
Right.
So go ahead, Dan.
Right.
You go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to say it always reminds me of the guy who gets thrown in jail for kiting a bad check, and so he writes a bad check. He gets thrown in jail, and his wife comes down to the jail and bails him out with another bad check. That's pretty much what we've got going on right now in this country and worldwide. And the thing that I am fascinated with, and you and I have talked about this at some great extent, the fact that with all the so-called banking reforms and all the angst that came out of the credit crisis of 2008, 2009, they didn't do anything to reinstate the Glass-Steagall Act, which separates investment banking from traditional banking. And they also didn't do anything legislatively that put an end to the derivatives trading market. And right now, we've got two of the worst culprits in the system are still in place, and the only thing that came out of 2008, 2009 is the raping of the American people at the advantage of international and national banksters. Am I pretty much on target with that, Bob?
Yeah, perfect. I wish I had been smart enough to say it. But the that that we're here as sheep for their shearing that's why we had Brexit. That's why we had Trump. The world is sick and tired of the corruption and the fraud, not only with the political classes willing to sell us out for any reason. They're happy to sell us out, and they have elaborate scams like the Flathead Water Compact that I've just dedicated the last 3 years to do it. I just got off of a phone with a good friend of yours, Dan, from the Red Pill Expo, Richard Gage, and we have a reopening of the investigation on Building 7. Well, what I learned when I was doing my federal lawsuit and the instructed quantification of harm that the judge sent us home to do, what I've learned is that Enron, it was part of the evidence in Building 7.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Building 7 was taken down with thermite. There wasn't any airplanes that went into Building 7. And what I hope to do, and Richard Gage and I just formed a strategic alliance, so his Building 7 experts are part of the forensic audit, and I hope that we start to look at the fear that these elites, we'll just call them the elites, I won't name names, the fear that they're going to face 20 to life with RICO. The fear that that lawyers will be turned loose to get all of their assets and the lawyers pay themselves with what they've seized. This is RICO is the answer, the perfect answer to fraud and corruption. And what America really needs to see is RICO prosecutions brought in. And I'd like to see a line down the block of banksters and the elites and hedge fund managers and corrupt politicians do 20 to life for RICO. And I'd like them to sit in their prison cells and think about the fact that the lawyers got everything that they stole, and their families will not enjoy anything that they stole. That's what I hope to see, and I hope that the American people understand that there is a big connection between Building 7, where the Enron evidence was, the political class, which has sold out, and the theft of electricity and hydroelectricity from our dam infrastructure, and that theft has been going on since 1907. 1923 to 1929 was when it was in its heyday. Northwestern Development Corporation and John D. Rockefeller and John D. Ryan, Cornelius Kelly, they put together the first pump and dump, and it started in Montana. And it started with the hydroelectric power and the Montana Railroad, which was the biggest electric railroad in the country, and also the smelters that were getting the electric power. And that's all subject to theft and corruption. And I would like to see the theft and corruption addressed by RICO, and I'd like to see those who were involved in the destruction of the tactical diversion of 9/11 and the intentional destruction of Enron evidence in Building 7. I would like to see it all blended together with the theft of electricity that happens in Montana and has been happening since 1907, 1923 to 1929, 1944, and 45 to present. And I've challenged my competitor. I'm running for the United States Senate out of Montana. I've challenged my competitor, State Auditor Matt Rosendale, who's also Securities Commissioner, to do the forensic audit that was ordered by the federal judge. And I'd like this audit to be supervised by Richard Gage and Charles K. Ortel to make sure no funny business, no political gamesmanship takes place. We have to root out the corruption, and if Mr. Trump won't drain the swamp, I'll do it for him.
That's a great task, Bob, and I have to say that you've been promoting 3 films that I would recommend that our listeners pick up as well, and that is Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. That's one film. Too Big to Fail, that is another film about what happened in 2008 and 2009 with the financial collapse of America. And then one that you and I both have talked about a great deal, but it's a movie called The Big Short. And it talks about how the derivatives market was so apparent to some people that they literally were able to clean house on the investment banks and all the securities groups that held paper on these credit default swaps, and what a big scam that whole thing was. And Bob, you and I have had a lot of discussion about that. I appreciate the fact that you want to continue this effort right now.
No, I want all of the 4 million people that are listening to our voices to care, to be no longer financial illiterates, but to care, because the financial class have set up the American people to be sheared like sheep, and eventually the sheep are turned into lamb chops. I think we're about at the stage where they've sheared us enough. They know that we've been sheared enough. That we know that we're starting to wise up to the derivatives market, the International Swaps Dealers Association, J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and their control of the Federal Reserve. Did you know, Dan, that the IMF, the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve have stuck their man on the Flathead Joint Board of Control? We have banksters that are involved in the theft of electricity and water in the state of Montana, and my estimate is $1 trillion has been looted from the state of Montana, not only in electricity and water, but minerals and timber and land. They use the power generation to steal land, Dan. You're playing into your Agenda 21 theme, which is real stuff. When you have the Federal Reserve that has their man in charge of Montana's water, I think it's high time for forensic audit to be supervised by the best that are alive. And that forensic audit is already paid for by the Koch brothers grant to Montana State University's agricultural department. And Montana State University's agricultural department has in its charter that any regulations that affect agriculture it should be studied by the university. So why is this a forensic audit and the quantification of harm that the judge ordered in Washington, D.C., why are they refusing to do this? And the only thing I can think of is they can't afford for the truth to come out because of Building 7 and the Enron evidence that went down, and Enron's lobbyist. When Building 7 collapsed on 9/11, was Governor Mark Roscoe, who your audience may remember from the Hanging Chads. So yes, I'd like to be the next senator from the state of Montana. Not only to be a senator, but I want John Tester's seat on the Senate Banking Committee to make sure this crap stops.
Well, good for you. I really appreciate what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say here. And incidentally, just so that our listeners are aware of this, and I know that you are too, Bob, but the $2 trillion that Donald Rumsfeld reported the day before 9/11 was missing from the Pentagon accounts and was unaccountable through the defense budget. Those records were also in Building 7, and when Building 7 came down, that whole subject just kind of disappeared.
Is Donald Rumsfeld been exempted by an act of Congress from RICO?
Well, I wouldn't think so.
How about George Bush? How about George Bush and his Western crime family? Are they exempt?
Well, I don't think anybody is exempt from RICO. If they can use RICO, the governors can use RICO to try to silence people that doubt climate change. We certainly ought to be able to use RICO to prosecute honest-to-God perpetrators of real crimes.
Yeah, and I'd like to go to the United States Senate and submit a due bill for the $1 trillion that was looted from the state of Montana with the help of a corrupt political class, with the help of the Federal Reserve, with the help of the Treasury. And if we don't put our foot down now, our children will be left to be slaves. They're just slaves to a group of sharpies, guys who think that they're the smartest guys in the room. They're not. They're not the smartest guys in the room. We, the people, are the smartest guys in the room.
Well, according to the 3 films that you recommended, and I've seen those films, they are anything but the smartest guys in the room, because people like you and I were talking about this stuff before the collapse in 2008, and we're well aware of all the circumstances that were creating the house of cards that became the banking crisis of 2008, 2009.
Yeah, it's called the Greenspan put, and Greenspan addressed the dot-com bubble that all his buddies got caught in with a doubling in the collateral value of real estate at the Bank for International Settlements. And then when the real estate was considered higher value collateral than Caterpillar Tractor's receivables, everybody turned their homes into a cash station, thus the pump and then the dump. I would like to also inform your listeners that when there was a dump, all of the derivatives were in place. The credit default swaps were in place. And there were people that made a lot of money. The federal government had to bail out those gambling debts and pay them off, but AIG and Citibank wrote most of the premium on those credit default swaps. In fact, Goldman Sachs had put out the securitizations, the bonds or the collateralized debt obligations, bushel baskets full of debt, and they knew which parts in the bushel baskets were garbage, and they sold credit default swaps against it. And they sold them for pennies on the dollar, and they went to unimaginable premiums. And those credit default swaps were sold at the direction of Rubin, formerly from Goldman Sachs, arbitrage partner at Goldman Sachs. Robert Rubin instructed Thomas G. Maharis from Shatkin Trading at the Board of Trade, instructed Thomas G. Maharis to write that premium. And so all those premiums that were sold at a quarter, an eighth, a half, went to $100, and the taxpayer had to sell it. And the places that sold it were AIG and Citibank, both which failed. And Goldman Sachs did a predatory move on AIG and Citibank and had those companies write the credit default swaps, and Goldman Sachs pawned the hedges off as their own product. So I'd like to see Henry Paulson and Robert Rubin, his roommates, for 20 to life, and everything that they have made clawed back and disgorged to the American public. I want the forgotten man to be taken care of. That's why I'm running for Senate. It's time that the forgotten man get his fair share. They got $13 trillion worth of bailout from the printing presses. Main Street got nothing. And that's why I'm going to the United States Senate, to do the bidding of the forgotten man. Mr. Trump has not done his job. Mr. Trump should be ashamed of himself that some private citizen is talking about this stuff a year after the election.
Right. Well, and the other part of that, Bob, is that I know that Trump, you had plans, and you've actually suggested several of his key advisors. You were one of the persons promoting them, and several of those people have been there. And is it my understanding they've been economic advisors, and they've been trying to tell him what's going on with the credit market?
We've got Mnuchin, was nothing other than Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan and the International Swaps Dealers Association. We got Steve Koch, who put out all of the bad paper from Chicago Bank Corp. We need somebody like William K. Black from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, who was the #1 white-collar crimes expert in America since the savings and loan debacle. Mr. Black, Dr. Black, said that the reason that we had the collapse of 2008 is because the Federal Reserve refused to enforce their own anti-fraud provisions. I want to see people like Charles Ortel, William K. Black, and Christopher Whalen surrounding Mr. Trump. And that's why I approached the Trump campaign well before the July 18th victory at the Republican convention. I wanted my people in place so we could clean up the swamp.
Well, it looks to me like you certainly tried to do your part. Can you talk to our audience a little bit? I know there's you've published, at least to me, an article about the $14.3 quadrillion lien against the United States and all of our resources by international credit dealers. Can you kind of give us a little background on that and tell us a little more about that?
The full faith and credit of the United States has been compromised with a $19 trillion debt. We went at $19 trillion in debt. Why can't the rest of the world? Why can't Kuwait and UAE and Qatar just borrow against their trade deficits? And this quadrillion dollar lien is basically the bankers saying, your heartbeat, your children, your wife, your house, your business, it all belongs to us. If we want it, we'll take it. And so the same attitude came about with the Jamie Dimon bankster bail-in bill of 2014, fourth quarter of 2014. Jamie Dimon's bankster bail-in bill followed in the wake of the seizing of Russian assets in Cyprus at the direction of the European Central Bank. And they just took the money. No due process, no hearing, no nothing. And so Jamie Dimon said, "Oh, that sounds really good." He said, "Let's pass a law, since they own these politicians and have since the 106th Congress that was primarily responsible for the destruction of the American economy. The Jamie Dimon bankster bail-in bill of fourth quarter of 14 said that if 1.25 quadrillion in derivatives go tits up, that 6,700 community banks and all of their depositors will bail it in, and they'll make good on all of the derivatives that go bad. These are the type. Jamie Dimon is the type of person that has the immediate attention of Mnuchin. Amity Shale talked about the forgotten man. The forgotten man ought to have a representative right there to make sure that Jamie Dimon is held accountable, that Mnuchin is held accountable, that the International Swap Dealers Association is held accountable, that J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs are held accountable. And the type of person that will hold them account were the people that I just named. Or I'd be happy to do it if they don't want to step up. But this sharing of the American public is over. It's got to be over. It's the only way we're going to save this country. Is a ride herd on the paper pushers at Wall Street who do it's the financial economy. The financial economy is and its corruption has been a lead ball chained to the real economy of the United States of America, and if we don't fix it, we're all going to be communists.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that, Bob. And the thing that I think our listeners need to understand is that in 2008 and 2009, with all the machinations that happened in the banking system and the credit system, everything that was done to basically cover up what was really happening and how the international, and I use the term banksters, were literally raping the American public and destroying the future of our children and our grandchildren. All those things happened, and we really haven't had any substantive turnaround in anything in our economy. They've doped the numbers on unemployment. They've doped the numbers on borrowing. They've doped the numbers on virtually everything that has to do with the economy of the United States and the economy of the world at large. And we've been living on borrowed time for the last 8 or 9 years. And frankly, nothing has changed except that it's gotten much worse in the magnitude and in the scope of the rape. Am I right on that?
You're absolutely correct, and we can boil it down to 2 words: regulatory lawfare. The deep state is conducting regulatory lawfare on the American people. The banksters are conducting regulatory lawfare on the American people. The UN is conducting regulatory lawfare on the people. And I think the American people, all 4 million of your listeners, should be cheering for a forensic audit that comes out of Montana, where all of this hydroelectric begins, the headwaters. The only way to drain the swamp is to start at the headwaters. And I implore your 4 million listeners to demand a forensic audit of the water and electricity that comes out of Montana, as was instructed, ordered by a federal judge in Washington, D.C. They're not doing it. The western branch of the Bush White House, or the western branch of the Bush crime family, is in control of the state of Montana, and it's got to stop.
Well, Bob, do our favor as a listener, our listeners a favor, and kind of explain how that whole process came about starting in 1907, and how our natural resources have been used as a, let's call it a pawn in the game of money in international banking. Kind of get into the weeds a little bit and explain how all that came about.
I'd be delighted. In 1907, John D. Ryan, John D. Rockefeller, and Cornelius Kelly came up with a scheme that had to do with water and electricity and hydroelectric. And they needed an electric train beginning in Harlowtown, Montana, to run in towards the mines in Idaho, and then to scoot back to Illinois with cows and minerals and that sort of thing. So the largest electric railroad came out of Montana, and it was powered with the hydroelectric dams that were built. And that electric power ran the smelters, and it ran the railroad. And people learned that electricity is no different than a Bitcoin or a gold bar or a bushel of wheat or a side of beef. And it's a commodity that can be traded. As we learned from Enron, the smartest guys in the room, I encourage your listeners to watch that and understand that electricity as a commodity can be diverted or stolen or sold in a forward futures contract and traded just like something in the pit at the Chicago Board of Trade. And so the smartest guys in the room got in bed with politicians, and they made sure that the electricity was diverted to satisfy their forward contracts and things of that nature. So what we need to do is understand that from 1907, when they built this railroad, and then in 1940 or 23 to 29, the Northwest Development Corporation issued $300 million worth of bonds and 6 million shares, which they bought companies with, and they pumped the stock until 1929, and then there was a crash, and everybody who sold their companies or whatever else the stock was used for was hung. The bonds defaulted, but the electricity continued to be made. And the bonds that were issued, 23 to 29 or 44 and 45, they had sinking funds, which sinking funds is where you set money aside to pay the bond off. These monies were supposed to pay off the debt. Instead, the debt was rolled 18 separate times, and I've been corrected 22 times. How can you be paying something off with electricity that comes off of a hydroelectric dam that works 24 hours a day, 365 days a year? Why would you have to continue to roll those debt securities? Why would Mr. Rockefeller, Ryan, and Kelly's bonds default, thus causing the Great Depression of 32 to 41 because of what happened to the people? The same thing happened to the people in the crash of 08. It was a pump and dump. These people are setting up more pumps and dumps because they need volatility. They need beta in the market in order to fleece you. And I think the American people have a responsibility to step up to the plate and demand that the swamp begins to drain in Montana at the headwaters. And that's why I want to go to the United States Senate. I want to present a due bill for the people of Montana to the United States Senate, and I want to expose this thievery, this elitist attitude that thinks that we're here for their fun and profit. That's got to stop. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I am not here to make sure some swaps dealer makes money. And we did not set aside money for our retirements for the last 40 years, only to have zero interest rate policy that comes out of the LIBOR markets in London, as brilliantly described by Matt Taibbi and Rolling Stone. We've had zero interest rates, and all the savers have been taken to the cleaners. You got nothing on your treasury bills, your treasury bonds, your bond funds. You got nothing. You got nothing on your CDs. It's all going to the international swaps dealers, so they can enjoy zero interest rates on their global derivatives book. Mm-hmm. So we have undergone this for 8 years. And anybody who understands actuarial tables understand that if you're getting zero interest rates instead of the rule of 72, 9 times 8 is 72, you should be getting 9% in order to double your money every 8 years. We've been 8 years since the real estate collapse. We've been in zero interest rate policies since the real estate collapse, and all of that money was taken from the Treasury and the Federal Reserve and sent to the international swaps dealers so they wouldn't have to pay to carry their derivatives book. Now we have pensions, people's pensions that they've saved for 40 years, have no returns for the last 8 years. And now we have pensions that are at risk of going broke. That's called return of capital. If they continue to send you your own money back and get no returns, then we've been kicking this can down the road for 8 years, folks. It's time to step up and call bullshit on the International Swaps Dealers Association, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and the corrupt political class that is seeing to it that the American people get fleeced while Wall Street enjoys the benefits.
Well, and that also explains, Bob, why the markets are, the Dow's at 22,000, in spite of the fact that many of these companies aren't doing that well as far as producing anything. But the bottom line is they can borrow money at 0% interest. They can buy their own stock back, or they can continue to invest in a stock market, which is showing a pretty decent return, and using that as a way to make a ton of money while the investors and the savers are going broke.
Going broke, and we continue to fund a trade deficit. Again, I say Mr. Trump is brilliant. I like every movie he's made. I don't particularly care for his demeanor, but we're not going to sue him for decorum offense. Mr. Trump has made all of the right moves. He signed 2 executive orders to study the trade deficit. We can't continue to kick this can down the road of funding a trade deficit, and we certainly can't kick the can down the road with a corrupt political class who is bowing and scraping to the paper pushers, the financial economy of Wall Street at the expense of the real economy.
Well, we've had virtually zero growth in the real economy. They've padded the numbers to try to make everything look much better than it really is, but our real structural unemployment rate really hasn't changed that much over the last 8 years. As a matter of fact, now structurally we have more people who are permanently unemployed than any other time in the history of this country by a long shot. And we've got a whole series of folks that have literally given up on even trying to get a job, and now they just live off the system using food stamps and public assistance.
Right. And as long as they can continue to get their EBT cards reloaded, they won't fight back. And so, but the welfare is, they're printing debt in order to give you more welfare. It's called Cloward Plivin. And they're going to collapse the system.
Yeah,
they're going to collapse this system if America doesn't wake up and ride herd on the corrupt political class, the regulatory capture, regulatory arbitrage, and regulatory takings that are going on, and the regulatory lawfare that is being conducted against the American people by people with clout. People with financial clout. Well, I'm here to tell the forgotten man that it's time to use your own clout, whatever clout it is. If it's getting on the radio with Dan Happel and calling BS, whatever you got to do, get involved and stop the corruption, or be prepared for your children to be communist.
Well, and that's been the whole program of the world government movement for the last 50 or 60 years, is to basically destroy our capitalist system, destroy our sound economy and our social order in a way that allows the inclusion of socialism and then eventually communism is our system of government.
Not as long as I take a breath.
Or me. You're in good company, Bob.
I'm not packing an AK-47, but I do know that RICO is one of our best responses. Let's line them up and put them into Leavenworth for 20 to life, and make sure that this stops.
Well, you're right, and we need to make sure that the American people wake up to the reality of the situation we're in. This is not a game or something that's wishful thinking. This is a reality of the world that we're moving toward, and the only way that we're going to stop this freight train which right now seems to be out of control, is by standing up, paying attention, waking up, and listening and reading and learning about the system, and then stand up with congressmen and our senators and make sure that they understand that we expect them to do their job. Bob, I know you're running for the U.S. Senate. Have you made an announcement to that effect yet on the national and state level?
14 months to go, Dan. In direct answer to your question, we have a filing deadline of March 20th, and I'm running for office 24/7 right now. I just haven't filed. I haven't bothered to go fill out the forms. But there's a pretty good number of people in Montana that already know that I want to be the next senator. I want to be the senator on the Senate Finance Committee, Senate Banking Committee.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, you'd be the perfect guy to be on the Senate Banking Committee, because I don't think there's anybody in the country that has a better knowledge about how the financial markets, the bond markets, credit markets, all that stuff work than Bob Fanning.
I love you, Dan. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I intend to do exactly what I said, to go stand in the United States Senate for the poor, the voiceless, and the common man, also known as the forgotten man. Thank you, Steve Bannon, and thank you, Amity Shales.
Well, Bob, I guess our listeners, we need to have you explain to our listeners some of the things that you see coming up in the next 6 months to a year that are going to maybe precipitate a major problem in the financial markets and the collapse of the financial markets if we don't stand up and do something now.
And this is not difficult, folks. I'm going to give you some simple tools. I mentioned earlier to study, thanks to Google Alerts, the market, M-A-R-K-I-T, credit default swaps. Pay attention to those, see what sovereign debts are failing and what markets are weak. Then I would also point to not just the stock market, those are financial assets, but look at the employment rate. Watch the trade deficit. And understand that interest rates go up or go down, and they also go up. And the reason I said to Charles Ortel and Christopher Whalen on October 7th of 14 that I was the greatest bear market trader that ever lived, which is crap, there's much better than me, but when interest rates go up or the bond market goes down, they go down 3 times as fast as they go up. So when the bond market starts telling you, you don't have to be a bond expert, just keep an eye on the Treasury bond future at the Chicago Board of Trade. And then I'll give credit to my friend and colleague, Charles Ortel. We commiserated about the end back in 14, the end of the bond bubble. And what we want to watch, and what I want your listeners to look up in Investopedia and understand to the core of their being, understand what counterparty risk is. Because all of these OTC derivatives are private treaty transactions, unregulated, unmargined, and if one of the counterparties fail, that will set off a daisy chain reaction. And I want your listeners to be defensive when they see words counterparty failure, and understand that if the counterparties fail, that the general counsels walk into the portfolio managers, and they don't ask for permission. They say, as a condition of your continuing employment, get the hell out of everything that is an over-the-counter derivative. And the kids can either liquidate their position right then and there in obedience to the general counsel, or leave. There's no freezing with these trades. So counterparty failure is something I want all 4 million of your listeners to understand, because these things are not regulated by government. Brooksley Bourne, the chairwoman of the CFTC, begged for permission to regulate them, and they ran her out. And if your listeners want to watch a video about that, it's Frontline.
Mm-hmm.
The men who sold the world. And we had a corrupt 106 Congress that only got worse since. And it's time to regulate.
Well, and Hank Paulson had a very key part in that, basically the shutting down of Brooksley Bourne and her request for investigation and understanding of how that market works.
Because he had big ambitions of peddling all of these collateralized debt obligations, these securitizations, and dumping all of this toxic garbage into every nook and cranny of the world, and then telling everybody it was going to be okay if they bought credit default swaps against these collateralized debt obligations with areas targeted for failure. So it's time that your listeners understand that Warren Buffett was dead right. These are weapons of mass financial destruction, and these weapons of mass financial destruction are aimed squarely at the foreheads of every American out there. And the end game is to force you into communism.
Well, and the other thing that I would highly recommend, and again, we alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I would recommend that all of our listeners go out and rent or buy the DVD, The Big Short. That's a movie that came out about 2.5 years ago, and it deals exactly with the subject of credit default swaps and how that whole Mickey Mouse system works. And the thing that we need to understand, and Bob, you certainly understand this, I do too, is the fact that they've done nothing to regulate the derivatives market, and it failed in 2008, and AIG and a whole number of other companies and corporations around the business world had to be bailed out. And that cost the American taxpayers many, many trillions of dollars, not the $853 billion that so many of our listeners probably thought was the total, but in some estimates it could go as high as $26 trillion that was used to bail out the international markets and derivatives.
And I'll do you one better, Dan. I met with a guy who was running for Congress, and I brought up the Greenspan put as illustrated in The Big Short. And I told him when we had the collapse of 2008, and 10 million people lost their homes and 14 million people lost their jobs, I said that for every 1% that the unemployment rate went up, 40,000 people died. So I'm here to call the ISDA, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan genocidal maniacs, because it was a planned trade. It was a rigged trade. The whole Greenspan put was a rigged trade.
Well, Bob, with that, I hate to say it, but we've run out of time. We're at the end of the the program. But again, as always, you've given us a tremendous, let's say, view of the financial world in a way that only someone with your expertise can truly understand. And I hope our listeners appreciate the fact that we've had such a great opportunity to understand just how serious this whole situation is. So, Bob, thank you again for being our guest, and I'll be in touch with you on a regular basis to talk to you about other things that are going on in the financial markets. And with that, I would ask our listeners to tune in next week to Connecting the Dots and hear more information on how we are being manipulated into a world that is something totally different than we thought we lived in. And with that, I'll turn the program back over to you, Kelby, and thank our listeners for tuning in to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Thank you, and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.